Thank you. Hello, everyone. Welcome back. Thanks for taking time out and for making your way back here on time. We have a very good treat for you today at this panel 2, Development and Economic History. I will leave everything over to the co-chairs. They will introduce themselves and take it away. Over to you, colleagues.
Good morning, everyone. Welcome to day 2 of the Zeleza conference. My name is Nathalie Frédéric Pierre, and I am a proud Howard alumna of the Department of English and History, where I now teach as an assistant professor of African diaspora history. Before we dive into today's second panel, I would be remiss if I didn't acknowledge the impact of Paul Zeleza's scholarship on the African diaspora. In a strident critique of a murky concept known as humanitarian diasporas, Zeleza argues that the creation of new analytic concepts that become, quote, another homage to American intellectual navel-gazing or imperialism is no longer sufficient. Rather, Zeleza begins with the premise that, quote, the diaspora paradigm reconnects Africa to its peoples dispersed around the world and globalizes Africa, repositioning the continent in world history. Africa's repositioning in Zeleza's work expands our cartographic imagination, asking us to wonder about Africa's impact on what he calls colonial Europe, the 7 centuries of North African domination of Iberia, or challenging us to think beyond the Atlantic African diaspora to include older African diasporas in the Mediterranean or Indian Ocean worlds. In my own research on Haitian independence, I am inspired by Dr. Zeleza's reflection on Madiba's passing. He argued that Madiba was one of the few post-colonial African leaders to survive decades behind his leadership. This expanded my imagination around Haitian independence because most of Haiti's early leaders never made it past a decade after independence. So when we're thinking about state crafting across the African diaspora, Zeleza is offering us concepts to return Africa's diasporas to a model that makes sense to Africans all over the world. And with that, I will yield the time to the actual chair of this panel, my colleague, Dr. Ademide Adelusi-Adeluyi.
Good morning, everyone. It's still morning now. My name is Ademide Adelusi-Adeluyi. I'm a new associate professor of history here at Howard University. This morning, we're having a kind of combined version of the panels. We will have a panelist from the Women and Workers Movement panel first, and then we'll go into the rest of the papers from the Development and Economic History panel, and we'll go in order. So our first speaker is Norman Asselmeyer from the University of Oxford, whose paper is titled Transnational Roots of Kenyan's Strike Movement, Railway Construction Workers' Struggle in East Africa. And I would ask that every speaker use 15 minutes because we do have 5 presentations and we'd love to get to Q&A. Thank you. So they're going to cue him up. So he's presenting on Zoom. Oh, they said he was online. Yes. No. Okay. All right then. Excuse me. You're right, ma'am. He will not be able to present this morning. He's no longer on Zoom. So we're going to go straight into the Development and Economic History panel. Our first speaker is Edward Luwanja from the Match Foundation in Malawi. His paper is titled Reimagining Africa's Economic Futures, Engaging with Paul Zeleza's Contributions to Economic History and Development Studies. So folks, remember we have 15, okay, let's say we have 16 minutes now since we have less. Just trying to make sure we stick to the time that we lost. Thank you.
Now, friends, colleagues, esteemed guests, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending on where you are. It is a distinct honor, and I must confess, a moment of immense personal pride for me as a Malawian to present before you today. My name is Luwanja, and I serve as a programs coordinator for March Foundation, all the way from the University of Malawi, where the good professor attended his first degree. So 13 or 14 years ago, I first encountered the profound writings of Professor Paul Tiyambe Zeleza. I remember vividly enjoying his literature, always wondering, who is this man who writes so profoundly and communicates so effectively? And now today, I have the incredible privilege of presenting a topic directly in line with this man's seminal works. So Professor, if you're listening, thank you for writing about Cherry and Chola in Smothering Charcoal and for laying such a profound and powerful intellectual foundation for us. So it is with this deep appreciation that I invite you to join me as I dive into reimagining Africa's economic futures, engaging with Paul Tiyambe Zeleza's contributions to economic history and development studies. Yeah, so just as an introduction, you see that Professor is such an profound intellectual figure, and he has profoundly shaped African economic history and development studies. So he has challenged narratives, and his work, as you will see, it consistently challenges dominant, often Eurocentric narratives that obscure African agency and development complexities. So our key focus areas look at deconstructing limiting narratives, analyzing post-colonial development challenges, and reflecting on African economic self-determination, and of course, the enduring relevance of the professor's scholarship, which is vital for navigating Africa's economic future in an interconnected world. So as we contextualize his intellectual legacy, I think much has already been said on his academic journey, but this work draws, or this paper draws on his landmark publications, that is a modern economic history of Africa and the study of Africa, volume 1. So intellectual influences, you see that his work shows an intellectual lineage connected to Pan-Africanist ideals. You see the works of Kwame Nkrumah and analysis of colonial underdevelopment, Walter Rodney, as well as Ali Maz, who is focused on African identity and globalization. And may you please note that we do not intend to remove the ultimate responsibility for development from the shoulders of Africans. So deconstructing Eurocentric narratives, what does the professor have to say? You see that a central and enduring contribution of Professor Zeleza's scholarship lies in his incisive critique of Eurocentric interpretations that have historically shaped the study of African economic history and development. He challenges the artificial separation of North Africa from the rest of the continent, exposing this division as a product of European imperialist arrogance and racism, and during the 19th century, a racist construct intended to divorce North Africa from the mainstream of African history. So you see that in Africa, there are diverse trajectories written across the continent. And this perspective directly confronts Eurocentric tendencies to marginalize or exclude North Africa from broader African historical narratives, and thereby distorting a historic understanding of the continent's past and present. See that furthermore, Zeleza critically engages with the dominant historical paradigms that have informed the analysis of African economic change and development in the pre-colonial era, the neoclassical, the dependency, and Marxist schools of thought. He argues that these frameworks, often imbued with Eurocentric biases, offer partial and sometimes misleading analysis of African economic realities, perpetuating myths and stereotypes about the African past. So Zeleza contends that scholars within these traditions have often been over-eager to impose universalizing models that fail to capture inherent diversity and complexity of the African experience. In contrast to these extremely driven analysis, Zeleza emphasizes the critical importance of internal African dynamics and the agency of African societies in shaping their own economic transformations. He underscores the significance of recognizing the domestic motor of economic change, highlighting innovation that is indigenous, evolution that is indigenous, and internal contradictions as key drivers of historical development. Zeleza's A Modern Economic History of Africa provides concrete illustrations of his challenge to establish narratives, and his deliberate placement of chapters on trade towards the end of the book strategically shifts the analytical focus to production as a primary engine of economic activity in pre-colonial Africa, directly countering prevailing scholarship that often overemphasizes external trade as the primary catalyst for change. Moreover, he critiques simplistic and often pejorative characterizations of African agriculture as uniform and changing or simple or backward, and meticulously detailing the diverse and sophisticated agricultural practices that existed across the continent. Allow me to look at the enduring shadow of colonial legacies on African economies. So Professor Zeleza's analysis extends beyond the pre-colonial era to a profound examination of the enduring impact of colonial structures on the economic development of Africa. He demonstrates how colonial economies were fundamentally designed to serve the interest of the colonizing powers, inherently characterized by being extroverted, export-oriented. You see that all over Africa, monoculture, being reliant on narrow range of commodities, sometimes even disarticulated with poorly integrated economic sectors and deeply dependent on external markets, technology, and capital. And this external-oriented and structurally imbalanced economic architecture was fundamentally inimical for the long-term sustainable development of African societies. And the legacies of colonialism manifest in multifaceted ways that continue to shape development challenges across Africa. And the systemic alienation of land for European settlers, the brutal imposition of forced labor regimes, and the strategic prioritization of export-oriented agricultural production are stark examples of colonial policies that inflicted long-lasting detrimental effects on African economies and social structures. And you see that these policies often resulted in the neglect of food production for local consumption. If you check all over Africa, countries are struggling to have their own food produced for their own countries, creating vulnerabilities in food security and the forced integration of African economies into the global capitalist system as being in a subordinate role, primarily as suppliers of raw materials to fuel European industrial growth. You see that all across Africa, we're always exporting things that we import back. We export raw materials and then we import back the very same things just in a finished form. So there've been these enduring shadows of colonial legacy in Africa. Let's navigate the global maze or globalization. So his nuanced perspective says Zeleza acknowledges opportunities that exist in trade, but also significant challenges that are deepening dependence, exacerbating inequalities posed by globalization, and the role of the African diaspora. He recognizes the diaspora's potential as a crucial source of remittances, investment, and knowledge transfer. his critique of neoliberalism and academia. Zeleza critically analyzes how neoliberal globalization impacts African universities and intellectual production. You look at academic capitalism, which can undermine the core values of higher education, challenges which include brain drains, resource scarcity, and the dominance of Western epistemologies that often marginalize African perspective. You see that in higher education. Professor Ngugi one time wrote in his book to say, decolonizing the mind, that Africa needs to decolonize its own education. You see that as a prevalent theme in most of Professor Zeleza's works. So the strategic engagement where African nations must engage strategically with globalization, promoting African agency to avoid perpetuating historical dependence. And then we look at the persistent scourge, inequality and underdevelopment in Africa, where you see that growth versus development. In his work, he highlights the gap between economic growth rates and tangible improvements in the lives of ordinary Africans, arguing that oftentimes growth fails to translate into inclusive development. Historical injustices, his analysis will underscore the profound role of the transatlantic slave trade and European colonialism in shaping deep-seated patterns of underdevelopment, the impact of the structural adjustment programs in the 1980s and 1990s for increasing inequality, reducing social spending, and marginalizing vulnerable populations. So there are contemporary challenges, and he addresses the high rates of unemployment, poverty, particularly among youth, linking them to slow industrialization and the precarious informal sector employment. So there is a call to us today as Africa to take a comprehensive approach. Overcoming these issues requires addressing the historical injustices, challenging the neoliberal policies, promoting inclusive growth, and of course, creating sustainable employment. Now, there is an enduring relevance to Zeleza when we situate his arguments of the past with contemporary debates. Looking at universities as drivers of development, you see that Zeleza emphasizes the role of African universities in generating context-specific knowledge, expertise, and research for sustainable solutions. This is pertinent for achieving sustainable development goals. You see that much of our research, in as much as Africa is conducting research, but what we are saying is that universities should drive research that is based on what the African at the local level is really encountering, not research that is at the topmost Eurocentric in nature. You look at Pan-Africanism and regional integration. His advocacy for Pan-Africanism and deep regional economic integration remains crucial for economic self-reliance and a stronger collective voice. Look at decolonization of knowledge. Zeleza's critique of Eurocentric narratives, it provides a vital basis for decolonizing knowledge and knowledge production, curricula in African institutions that let curricula in African institutions be African even in its nature. So we look at centering African perspectives. His work encourages centering African experiences, indigenous knowledge, and even diverse voices in addressing development challenges. There is aspirational vision, persistent constraints, and looking at critical reflections. So we look up to optimism versus reality. That while Zeleza conveys optimism for self-determination, it's crucial to reflect on the limitations due to deeply entrenched obstacles. Yes, there is a sense of optimism. There is a sense that maybe Africa can advance or Africa can become one. So as we navigate the global maze and as we look at the different arguments that have been put forward, we're saying there are persistent constraints that Africa faces as a continent, and there are reflections that Africa must make. So while Professor Zeleza's work often conveys a strong sense of optimism regarding Africa's inherent potential for achieving meaningful economic determination, it is crucial to engage in a critical reflection of the potential limitations and of course, inherent tensions that may exist within his analysis, particularly concerning the feasibility of overcoming deeply entrenched obstacles, Zeleza's powerful articulation of African agency and the potential for Pan-African solutions is inspiring, yet the path towards realizing this vision is fraught with significant geopolitical and institutional constraints that his work, while highlighting historical causes, sometimes portrays with a degree of idealism concerning future transformation. Look at the enduring structural legacies of colonialism as discussed by Zeleza. They are not merely historical footnotes, but they continue to manifest in global power imbalance. African nations often operate within an international economic system where terms of trade for primary commodities are even volatile. So global financial institutions are exerting considerable influence, and the dominance of established global economic powers limits room for independent policymaking. So while Zeleza advocates for strategic engagement with globalization, the reality of unequal power relations means that this engagement can easily slip back into patterns of dependence, challenging the realization of genuine self-determination. And furthermore, the institutional weaknesses that Zeleza acknowledges, often rooted in colonial administrative structures, coupled with issues like corruption, internal political instability, and capacity deficits. They present formidable barriers to implement transformative economic policies and fostering the regional integration he champions. So his focus on the potential of African universities is vital, but these institutions themselves face significant underfunding, brain drain, and the pressure of global academic trends. So this limits their capacity to fully drive the innovation and knowledge creation needed for racial economic shifts. Therefore, we're saying Zeleza correctly identifies the historical roots of underdevelopment and articulates a compelling vision for an African-led economic future. But the practical implementation faces immense challenges. The gap lies not in the accuracy of his historical diagnosis or the desirability of his goals, but in the profound difficulty of dismantling entrenched global inequalities and strengthening domestic institutions sufficiently to translate the potential for agency into widespread, tangible, and sustained economic self-determination against powerful external forces. Therefore, critical engagement with Zeleza's work necessitates acknowledging this tension between the aspirational power of his vision and the persistence, often overwhelming constraints on the ground. Let me conclude by saying that the significance and enduring contribution of Professor Paul Zeleza to the fields of African economic history and development studies fulfill the objectives that have been set forth. We have analyzed his power critique of Eurocentric narratives that has distorted the understanding of Africa's economic past, highlighting his insistence on the centrality of African agency and internal dynamics. So after exploring the insightful analysis of his post-colonial development challenges and tracing persistent and often unequal dynamics of globalization, we need to confront the pervasive issues of inequality and underdevelopment. And tools for the future, we may say that his advocacy for African agency, decolonization of knowledge, and strategic importance of African institutions provides us with a vital intellectual foundation for reimagining development paradigms centered on African priorities. So his enduring legacy, his scholarship remains profoundly relevant even in contemporary debates on sustainable development and Pan-African economic integration. Thank you, and happy birthday, Professor.
Thank you so much. It turns out we have even more time than we expected. So our next presenter is Adelusi-Adeluyi, who is at Academia Sinica in Taiwan, or Sinica. His paper is titled Africa, Challenges of Development and AFCFTA. He will be presenting virtually. Oh, fantastic. Good, very good morning to you. We can't hear you. Oh, there you go. Can you hear us? Please begin. We're waiting for you, sir. Please begin.
Uh, Thank you very much, Chairperson. Actually, I wasn't hearing you out. My name is Gallows. Let me just try and see if I can display um, my PowerPoint. I was hoping that the PowerPoint would be shared. Sorry, let me just speak into the PowerPoint. I can't find it. So my name is Gallows, as I said. Please, moderator, should I go out of order? You just have to guide me. I've been jumping from one airport to another where I find myself in the world. It's already after midnight. Um, this particular study came out of the interest of an argument that Professor Zeleza made. As we all know, the topic of my presentation is Africa, Challenges of Development and Africa Continental Free Trade Area. So there is an argument that Professor Zeleza made when he argues the sheer size and diversity of African countries make it difficult um, to map general development patterns and trajectories since independence. He continues, in other words, the way Africa is configured into the global system makes it difficult to develop even after relying on development aid in the past decades. Now, let me try and bring a connection to myself and Prof. Zeleza. I used to work for the Thabo Mbeki African Leadership Institute at the University of South Africa some years back. And Professor Zeleza is actually a household name in Africa. It's a brand. So at some point, we had to receive him as a keynote in one of our grandiose events that took place at that time. And from the knowledge that we gain from him through that keynote address, I then developed an interest to begin to start studying and reading some of his work, which I make use even in my thesis. Now, I must say that Professor Zeleza is someone that no one wants to ignore. because it's one of the African icon in the academia, in the diaspora. So basically, that's my thought with him. So in this presentation today, I'm just going to, by the way, this particular topic is something that I'm just touching it for the first time. So I'm going to give a brief introduction. I look into conceptual framework, trying to bring two concepts together. Then, of course, literature review, methodology and findings and discussion, and then conclusion, and then recommendation. So we all know that the issues of development are highly contested issues. It's one of the issues that have brought in a lot of debate. You know, while in the Thabo Mbeki African Leadership Institute, my boss, who was a very good boss to me, who hosted Professor Zeleza, also an expert in development studies, and he problematized the notion of development in very interesting ways. And the problematization of development comes from through a mentorship process of one of Africa's best brand, who unfortunately went into glory, by the name of Professor Tandiwe Kandawiri, who at some point argues, as opposed to other arguments that see the issue of, or the concept of development as an ambiguous concept. Kandawiri, for example, argues that it's not so much of an ambiguous term as it seems. This then takes me to Thomas, who argues that to be able to shield one from the ambiguity and the non-ambiguity in the concept of development, one just needs to look into it in three lenses, and in order to when you contemplate it on development. So Thomas argues that development must be perceived as a vision. It must take into account the course of history with the inevitable social change that is responsible for the alteration of a society's human relations and interactions over a period of time. And of course, he argues again that development must be looked at, development must consider looking at intentional efforts that aim at improving agencies, including government, civil societies, private sector, towards development. So in passing, what I just want to say is Africa is not only this colleague, Africa is also this. So the objectives of these studies actually is to just simple to find out how diversity, according to the argument of Professor Zeleza, impedes development in Africa post-independence, and also to determine why development aid failed to achieve development in Africa, and to examine the role of Africa continental free trade in fostering development. So in the conceptual framework, in as much as from my keywords, I have striking concepts that appear in these particular studies. I'm just going to create a relationship between development and Africa continental free trade. Now, on the issue of development, as a justification of the concept, I would say that development in this study refers to processes of positive change or progress in politics, economic, and social, including demography and environment. And after, I am going to look into just the protocol on trade and goods, or the protocol on trade in goods and the protocol on trade in services, to be able to bring in a relationship between these protocols and development. Now, on the basis of literature review, yes, a lot of scholars have argued that there is no universally accepted definition of development. However, Kandawiri said part of the reason is because development is multidimensional and a value-loaded concept. He further says, talks about development having a lot of conjuncture, meaning development has issues of incomplete knowledge. On the other hand, Busi Gumede, who used to be a mentee of Kandawiri, presented a couple of biases on not only on the theorization and conceptualization of development, but also the biases links to the way development is perceived, because the logic at some point is that development is premised on Eurocentric perception of how communities, for example, and people should evolve. Now, as said earlier, the study again is to look into how diversity impedes development in Africa post-independence, to determine why development aid failed to achieve development in Africa, and also to examine the role of AFTA in fostering development. Now, the methodology to look into to achieve the objectives of this study is that the study is adopting a descriptive qualitative method of that involves extensive literature review of secondary data, of public journal articles, on public theses and dissertations from university websites, government publications, book monographs, and other relevant sources. Now, I also use content analysis to analyze the data, because content analysis is best, form of analysis here, since it has to do with thematic coding. So in the finding, which I'm just stretching, colleague, because of time issue, is that on my objective 1, diversity and an impediment to development, is to say that despite the fact that ethnic and cultural assortment represent rich cultural heritage in Africa, its diversity has been weaponized to create mistrust among Africans. And we can see how mistrust play itself in the African continent and in terms of in relations to development. One way is that because this study is bringing a relationship between the African continental free trade and development, mistrust made majority of African countries before the African Continental Free Trade Agreement was ratified. Mistrust prevented African countries from trading among themselves. And a lot of scholars and development experts have written extensively on the disadvantage and the loss that Africa incur by attempting to foster trade with the European Union while ignoring intra-African trade, which has a lot of benefits. Now, in the objective 2, failure of development aid to achieve development in Africa, the reason which I will stretch in the full draft is that development aid failed to develop Africa amongst other reasons due to, first, the conditionality that is involved in development aid. We all know that one African problem, one way we can describe, especially Western development aid to Africa, is that it's an analogy whereby you give something with the right hand and you collect it back with the left hand, because we understand how much the conditionalities that are attached to certain development aid instead created an atmosphere of corruption. And of course, when there is corruption has a way of affecting governments. At the end of the day, there will be poor governance in the way the aid is being managed.
Gallus, I'm sorry to interrupt you.
We understand in Africa
Gallus, can you hear me?
There are situations where the problem of resource misallocation has been one of the hindrances of development aid achieving development purposes in Africa. I remember during the COVID-19 in South Africa, we had something that happened. The government had borrowed money, as part of COVID measures to save the people. And at some point, we watched on the news that graveyards were being dug as a response to the number of deaths that will occur during the heat of the COVID-19 pandemic. And of course, people did not die in response to the number of graveyards that were dug. And then money was also supposed to be paid after a while to cover those graves again. So the issue of resource misallocation, and this money for that came, the government of South Africa spent was actually aid, partly aid and loan that they received from supranational banks. So basically, this could be one of the issues one could clearly see is an issue of resource misallocation. So on the third objective, the role of AFTA in fostering development. Now, because again, there is a link between development and Africa continental free trade. Here, I try to make an argument that the African continental free trade has potential if it is successfully addressed, has potential to address long-standing barriers of intra-African trade that includes high tariffs and also non-tariff barriers in a market that is fragmented. As African states are fragmented in the context of borders, that's how African market is also fragmented. So the role of AFTA, as I see in this study, is that AFTA can actually foster a development. Actually, through the creation of a single market, trade can increase. The increase of trade can pull in investment, which can increase job creation. At the end of the day, through the job creation, there will definitely be a positive multiplier effect among Africans. To me, in this study, this is what I will consider development. So, as a recommendation,
Gallus, I'm sorry to interrupt
I'm
you.
not sure
Can you hear?
it's a topic that I'm looking for the first time. I'm not, I'm not so well vested yet in literatures on the African continental free trade. The reason I'm saying this as recommendation, I wish that Africa invest more on policies to govern AFTA in a robust and progressive manner. What I'm trying to say is that countries should not look only on their advantage, but let the advantage of everyone be considered. Let the continent be considered as it is a single market. Let it be considered as a single nation. And also in terms of the regional economic communities, the RECs, which are various economic communities in the African Union, I say that universities must be deeply implicated in all the processes, in things that has to do with the African continental free trade, for the purposes that, for the reason that the African continental free trade from literature has so much potential to provoke or catalyze the development that Africa wants. I thank you. My email is there. I am open for comment, criticisms, and so on. Thank you, moderator.
I'm not sure if you can hear me, but thank you so much, and you received a rousing round of applause. Thank you for joining us at 1 a.m. in Taiwan time. So, thank you. I know. So our final speakers will be Babajide A. Teller, who's a recent PhD graduate of Howard University. So congratulations. And are you both speaking together or separately? Okay, and Mohamedou Hayek, who is also here at Howard University. We've got tons of time, so you leave as much time as you want for Q&A. All right. Do you have a slideshow?
Oh, yes, we do.
Okay, so let's see. This is supposed to help you, or you should say next slide, and they'll change it.
Okay.
Okay. Okay. We're waiting for the slides to come. Okay. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Babajide Tella, and I'll be presenting today with my colleague from the Department of Political Science here at Howard University, Mustafa Hayek. We're happy to be part of this distinguished conference in honor of the highly revered and respected Professor Zeleza. Thank you for your happy birthday, Prof. Thank you for your intellectual contributions to the advancement of humanity and for promoting the well-being of the African continent and African people around the world. Today, we're presenting on a paper we'll be presenting a paper on a contemporary topic in Africa that affects Africa and which we know we are very passionate about. So our paper is titled The Beautiful Bride, Summit Diplomacy and Africa's Quest for Sustainable Development. In 2007, during a state visit to Senegal, the president of France, Nicolas Sarkozy, during a public address at the University of Dakar, made a statement that the tragedy of Africa is that it hasn't fully entered into history. This statement was widely criticized by scholars, activists, and intellectuals across the globe, expectedly. However, beyond the criticism, this statement is a realization of the fact that African states are not highly rated among the Community of Nations, and this has been the case since independence in 1960s, in the 60s, up until the start of the 21st century. So, however, there is renewed interest in Africa by global powers in the 21st century. This is illustrated by the multiplication of Africa Plus summits, Africa Plus One summits that's been organized by different states, the global powers, France, United States, Russia, China. Now we have Japan, India. All the states, all global countries generally are rushing to organize summits with Africa. And these summits are a continuation of geopolitical rivalry and great power competition in Africa. This is the thought of Soleil, published in 2020. They also demonstrate the increasing interest in Africa by global powers, which Professor Zeleza alluded to in one of his publications. And they raise important questions that our study investigates. Now, the research question guiding this study is how do Africa Plus summits advance the political and economic interests of African states? The study focuses on 4 countries that have embraced the idea of Africa Plus One summits. So we're looking at France, Russia, China, and the United States. In selecting our cases, we focus on ideology, basically by selecting 2 liberal democratic countries and 2 communist countries. So my colleague will take it.
So in this part of the presentation, we are inquiring whether France is a partner for life in Africa. So after the decolonization period, France maintained the colonial ties with a lot of African countries, mainly the former French colonies. So this led to what could be called maybe a family reunion, because in 1973, when the summit started, it was a gathering between France and only the French colonies. So that number started to grow in the 3rd summit, when the one that became the most inclusive summit, including Lusophone countries, and eventually it reached like the whole continent. But I have to say, when it started in 1973, this Franco-African summit was both spontaneous and strategic. It was spontaneous because it was a way for France to maintain its influence in Africa, coming from like the decolonization period, the 1960s, where most of Francophone countries gained independence. So it was a way for France to maintain its ties with its former colonies. But it was also strategic because it was a way for France to be an alternative and to counter Russian influence in Africa. So to this day, there's been 28 summits between France and Africa. Now it is not called Franco-African summits because Africa now is put first, so it's like Africa-France summit, and the last one was in 2021 in Montpellier in France. So as I mentioned earlier, the number grew from 11 being the 11 Francophone countries in 1973 to now reaching most of all of the countries in the continent. So it's an opportunity for business leaders to attend. So members of the civil society, trade unionists, both in France and in Africa usually attend these summits. So the discussions during these summits range from economy to security negotiations, security challenges, which are right now hot topics in Africa, considering all that's going on in the Sahel region mainly. So next slide. So the next country that we are interested in is Russia. So we are developing on the Russia-Africa summits, which started in 2019. So Russia's influence in Africa expanded because it was seen as an alternative to capitalism during the Cold War. But at the end of the Cold War, obviously, when the US came out as the winner of the Cold War, Russian influence ended, and even their physical presence in a lot of African countries through the embassies reduced significantly. So, but in the 2010s, with security challenges going on, mainly in Central African Republic with President Touadera, Russia made its comeback to the continent, providing security, military support to African countries. So that led to holding the first Russia-Africa summit in 2019 in Russia. So far there's been two, one in 2019 and the other one in 2023. So in terms of the numbers, the first summit was attended by a large number of African countries, 43, but then the second was only attended by 17. So that decline can be explained by the fact that the last one coincided with the invasion of Ukraine, and Ukraine being a top provider of grain to many African countries. So when Russia invaded Ukraine, there was a delegation of African leaders that went to Russia asking President Putin to provide grain through the Black Sea Grain Initiative, but President Putin declined the request. So that is one of the explanations why the number dropped from 43 to only 17 countries attending the second summit. So for now, according to many reports, according actually to the Minister of Foreign Affairs in Russia, the next summit is to be held in 2026, and they have planned to plans to hold it in an African country. So the summit is also an opportunity for business leaders in Africa to attend. So it focuses mainly on security challenges, also mainly on military support to African countries. So it's more narrowed compared to, the objectives are more narrow compared to the Francophone summit. So I'll pass it down to Babajide, who will expand on China.
Thank you. So the next country we're interested in is China. The summit between China and African states is referred to as the Forum of Africa-China Cooperation, FOCAC. So China has redefined summit diplomacy by adding color and glamour to the idea of summit diplomacies. The first FOCAC was held in the year 2000 at the start of the 21st century. So while the last summit was only recently held last year in 2024, FOCAC exemplifies China's new policy of aggressive engagement with Africa. While the first FOCAC was attended by over 800 officials from China and 44 African countries, the last FOCAC witnessed like a significant expansion with 51 African head of states in attendance. And 2 presidential representatives, the chairman of the African Union was invited, the Secretary General of the United Nations was also invited. So it shows that progressively the FOCAC has been, is getting bigger and bigger. So in addition to African leaders, China also invites business leaders, members of the private sector, and China focuses principally on trade, economy, and infrastructural development during Africa Plus summits. China phrases these summits in such a way as is seen as a South-South cooperation rather than a North-South cooperation. So this has made it more attractive to African countries to attend. The other country, the last country we're interested in is the US-Africa Summit. This is usually referred to as the US-Africa Leaders Summit. The US came late to the party, the summit parties. The US hosted the first Africa-US Leaders Summit in 2017, while the last summit was held in 2022. Initially, initiatives such as the African Growth and Opportunity Act, AGWA under President Clinton, Power Africa under President Obama, and the episodic security partnerships have failed to make Africa a sustained priority in US foreign policy. The first US-African summit was attended by 50 African leaders, which became the largest event the US ever held with African heads of states and governments. In addition to African leaders, the US invites members of civil society, business leaders, and the private sector. The Africa Leaders Summit focuses primarily on trade, economy, security, and human rights issues during the summits. However, contemporary US foreign policy appears to promote disengagement, seen in the recent cuts in development assistance to development agencies and countries, and this has intensified Africa's pivot towards alternative partners. So now we'll just do like a brief analysis of some important points that come out of. I'll invite my colleague to take it.
So the politics of hosting these Africa Plus One summits. So the frequency for the 4 summits, I think the most consistent summit is the FOCAC, which since 2000 has been happening every 3 years. For France, it started being a biannual summit in 1973. Then it moved to being held every 3 years, to being held also later on every year, to now it's very hard to tell because the last one happened in 2021 and the next one is scheduled to happen in 2026. Regarding, for the US, it only occurred twice in 2019 and then in 2023. So it's hard to tell when the next summit will happen because it's only based on which administration has interest in Africa. And apparently there are administrations that might not know even some of the, so what some African countries do, like where Lesotho is. So it's hard to tell. For the chairing of the summit, usually it is the host country and one head of state from Africa. So it is an opportunity to hold bilateral meetings. So usually during the summits, presidents or African presidents meet privately with the Western or Russian or Chinese president to discuss issues pertaining specifically to their countries. Next slide. So the cost of attendance. So as we all know, more than half of the world's 50 poorest countries are in Africa. That doesn't really align with the realities of the summits because we see that when the US is holding a summit, all the the majority of the head of states come with delegations, and that traveling that they do from Africa to either France or the US or China can be alleviated if it was done all online. And this is something that has been experimented during COVID. Most of the summits and most of the world leaders gatherings took place online. So that is, and it didn't really prevent the world from evolving. So there's also a huge lack of transparency regarding these summits because usually the ordinary citizen doesn't know what is involved. So there's, the cost is usually not made public, and that is an incentive for leaders to include anyone in their delegation. Next slide. So in our analysis also, we see that the Africa Plus One summits are somehow a perpetuation of dependence. So it contributes to the dependence of Africa on Western powers. These have been happening, in the case of France, for example, it's been happening for several decades, but still, we are still talking about the same issues in Africa. If not, in between, we've had new issues. In the case of China and Russia also, there are other concerns, even though maybe the dependence argument is more brutal when it comes to France. Next slide. So the evidence of double standard, it's true that countries don't have friends, they have interests. So countries that are under military rule are usually excluded from these summits when it's organized by France or by the US. But that is just like when we look at it on the surface level, because during the last summit, Chad was during the last summit, the US last summit, Chad was invited despite being under military rule, and even the military coup was not denounced by US leaders. Whereas Burkina Faso, Niger, and Mali, Sudan, all these countries that were suspended by the African Union were not invited in these summits. On the other hand, when it comes to Russia, Russia really doesn't put a lot of attention into the type of regime that is in place in these countries. I'll pass it on to Babajide for the next.
All right, so another issue that has emerged from this summit is that of implementing the resolutions and decisions reached during the summit. Several promises, while there have been tangible results, such as the gift of the African Union headquarters, several promises made during Africa Plus One summits go unfulfilled. For instance, Russia's promise to triple trade with Africa during the 2019 summit was never fulfilled, and a major challenge in fulfilling, in the US, a major challenge to fulfilling promises made during Africa Plus One summit is the difficulty in securing the approval of Congress, which has the power of the purse. Only a proposal that gets bipartisan support see the light of the day. Also, the pertinent question that has divided opinion is whose interest is being served in this summit. Powerful countries use the summit to showcase their influence, while African countries have secured loans, grants, infrastructural projects, and new businesses during the summit. Also, these countries use the summits to promote their national policies. For instance, the One China policy. I have a table after this that shows the countries that have broken diplomatic ties with Taiwan since the start of FOCAC in 2000. Ultimately, the overarching question is how these summits benefit the ordinary African. Like I said, since 2000, when the first FOCAC held in China, 7 African countries have broken ties with Taiwan, the most recent being Burkina Faso in 2018. The only African country that still maintains diplomatic ties with Taiwan is Eswatini, formerly Swaziland, and this is the only country that was not invited to the last FOCAC in 2024. So finally, to conclude, this study has identified a variety of patterns that powerful external actors have employed in organizing Africa Plus One summits. Global powers have used these summits to further the rivalry among them while also promoting their national interests, such as the one state policy in China that I just discussed. It is therefore clear that these summits do not significantly advance the political and economic interests of Africans, and it's actually a threat to the goal of African integration, as seen in the African Continental Free Trade Agreement. This is like a work in progress for us. Future research will focus on the perception of the public on Africa Plus One summits, and to look at how this summits, how summits organized by Japan and Africa, India and Africa, how they differ from those of the traditional global powers that we have looked at. Thank you so much for your attention.
Great. Thank you so much for your presentation. So we have at least 10 or 15 minutes for questions. So if you have questions, please come forward. Introduce yourself and ask your question.
Thank you very much for this very important topic that you are working on. I do realize that you may need to do more research on this, and that's probably why you didn't talk about the question I'm going to ask. But I'm really interested in trends to see where Africa is leading. And of course, we've got more than 54 countries, so it's difficult to say Africa is leading that direction or this direction. But what's the distribution? Where do people seem to be preferring to, which countries do they seem to be preferring to work with? The two binary ones are obviously the US and China, but then you also have France, and it's likely that the French-speaking countries are more likely to have a relationship with France. Also, what are the ideological implications of these Africa Plus summits? There are questions, many questions associated. Why should African countries be going to China or to France? Why doesn't China and France come to Africa? And also, the notion that African countries are poor, I think, needs revisitation. These countries want to talk to us not because we're poor. If we had nothing to offer them, they wouldn't be interested in us. They want to talk to us because we are wealthy, wealthy, wealthy. Thank you.
We'll take a couple of questions. And our other panelists are also still online if you have questions for them.
Good afternoon, colleagues. So my question has to do with the summits and the fact that we're having these summits, the businesses sector is invited, civil society, etc. Where is higher education in this? Do we think there's a role for higher education to be a part of these summits? And how do we get ourselves on the table in those spaces?
Okay, would you like to answer those questions?
Yeah, thank you for those questions that will help us improve this research. So I'll start with the first one. Regarding the notion of poverty, I think there are many indicators that we can look at. It's not well defined maybe in the presentation, but when we say Africa being at the bottom of the table for the world's poorest countries, we refer to the economic indicators. Not, yes, when we talk about wealth, Africa has the resources. That is why these foreign countries are willing to maintain ties with African countries. That is, I think that is obvious, but we were more referring to these indicators that say that when it comes to maybe basic needs, it is more developed elsewhere than in Africa in terms of health, in terms of in terms of like wages, in terms of a lot of other basic needs. So that's what we meant, and we'll make sure that we define it for it to be clear. The distribution question, before that, like the location, like where summits are held. So for the Francophone, the Africa France summits, they alternate between Africa and France. And it's the same for China also. When it happens like in China in 2000, in 2003 it happened in Africa, and then so on and so forth. For the US, as I mentioned, it's early to tell. All we know is both summits so far in 2017 and 2022 happened in the US. And for Russia also, both summits happened in Russia, but the foreign minister mentioned that the next one is planned to happen in Africa. For the Africa-France summit though, there is something new, because since 1973, it's been happening only in Francophone countries. But in 2026, it is scheduled to happen in Kenya, an Anglophone country, for the first time. So I think that is something important to mention. Regarding ideologies, what we can say is, like I mentioned in my presentation, those countries that offer maybe a kind of pessimistic view on Africa and Africa-West relations tend to be like, I won't say the favorite guest for Russia, but they tend to go to the Russia-Africa summit, and those countries, I can cite maybe the military regimes like Burkina Faso right now, Niger, Mali, Guinea. They are welcome in Russia, but they are not welcome in the US, under the assumption that they are suspended by the African Union. Yeah, and that follows the same pattern also. The US and France being at similar levels when it comes to ideology. On the question about the place of higher education, for the I can speak about the Africa-France Summit, the last one which took place in 2021 in Montpellier, France. So there was a mission of several months prior that was given to this intellectual Cameroonian, Achille Mbembe, to go to Africa and gather all the questions that members of the civil society, scholars, students might have to improve the relations between France and Africa. And Achille Mbembe, Professor Mbembe, gathered all those questions, and the summit changed, the style of the summit changed. It was not a summit between African presidents and Emmanuel Macron. It was a summit between President Macron and members of the civil society and scholars and students in Africa. So it was an opportunity for them to talk about all these neo-colonial ideas that are going on, and I guess by that, then decolonizing the education sphere cannot be overseen. So cannot be overseen. So it was an opportunity for students to voice their concerns about the franc CFA, about anything that relates to neo-colonialism.
Just to reiterate what he has said, African countries in search of security assistance mostly gravitate towards Russia, especially those in the Sahel. Those in charge of, in search of economic assistance gravitate towards China. And then for the US considers human rights records in inviting countries, although as we noted, there is evidence of double standard in this in terms of those who they invite or not. For the question on higher education, I think he rightly noted that the changing pattern of the France-Africa summits now tend to include the views of intellectuals in public universities in Africa, which is like a change to what used to take place in the past.
Thank you. We have time for at least one more question.
Maybe it's time for lunch.
Oh, I hear clapping. So thank you to all our panelists for participating, and we appreciate your presentations. Thank you. I think someone's going to make an announcement about lunch, but it's in 5 minutes. Thank you for your attention. Oh, are you coming? Good job, guys.
Thank you again. Thanks to the panelists, these amazing people, and thanks everyone for your attention and for still being here. We really appreciate it. It's going to be that time. I think we're 5 minutes before lunch, so it looks like lunch is even earlier. So I won't waste any of your time, but I will also say this has been such an amazing event. I know Professor Zeleza, I met him, I was a first-year PhD student. And you know, when you go to these conferences, you're always starstruck by the person whose book you read. And so I'd seen him in the back of a book cover, and I saw him, I darted. I said, Professor, how are you? And you always remember how people make you feel when you are just a student and you're unremarkable. And he was so nice to me. And he said, yeah, come, let's take a picture. And I kept that picture. And I say this as an anecdote to make the point that throughout the course of these 2 days, we've had such a wonderful time about a great person and a great human being, and have explored things beyond the man. It's very easy, though, for small things throughout the course of our, as human beings, to kind of disturb some of the spirit of what we do. So to anyone here, if you were here and maybe you didn't have a pleasant experience with any one person, just know that please forgive us. That person is no longer here, and please, when you write the history of your time at Howard when you came here, you need to write that part on water, and then write the rest of it on brass. So it wasn't us, and they're not us. This is us. Thank you. Enjoy your lunch.